So welcome everybody to our GCI Curious Convos series. For those of you who don't know, I'm Chris Munro. I'm Managing Director for Growth Coaching International, based here in Melbourne. And just a little bit about the format of this. We started this webinar series middle of last year, and we wanted it to be a series of curious conversations. The name Curious Convos is a classic Australian abbreviation, had to be convos, not conversations. Really the idea is it's two people with a shared topic of interest, chewing on that for a little while and seeing where we end up, just mulling it over, nutting it out is an Australian phrase that I know well now. But you get to pull up a chair and listen in, and we'll take questions as we go, and more towards the end, I suppose. So my job is to host, join in a little bit, because it is a shared topic for Mary-Clare and I, and I'll keep an eye on the question answer box. So if you want to post questions as you go, as they pop up in your head, then please post them, and I'll curate those and bring those in as we go. So the group's starting to grow here, and I know we've got an international dimension already from some of the names that I recognize there. So welcome. And we're going to have a bit of an international flavour this evening. It is for us here in Melbourne. I'd like to welcome Mary-Clare Relihan. I hope I got the pronunciation right.
You did, yeah.
Mary-Clare Relihan. And Mary-Clare works with pre-service teachers and their school-based mentors at the Faculty of Education at Monash University here in Melbourne. And Mary-Clare is also undertaking her doctoral research at Monash at the same time. You're a brave soul, and multitasking supreme there. Looking at coaching, mentoring, and adult learning. So welcome, and thank you for taking part in this, Mary-Clare.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm delighted.
Pleasure. So maybe we just start then by, the coaching question one of my colleagues gave me a while ago was what's the story that brought you here? Now, shorthand version of the story that brought you here, but clearly you have a relocation story the same as mine. Maybe But yeah, what brings you to your interest in coaching and mentoring in your current role?
I suppose I would often describe myself as a recovering primary school teacher. So I was very fortunate to be a primary school teacher for 12 years in Ireland and here in Melbourne. And I think it was probably in my Melbourne school out in Point Cook at Lim and Christie that kind of sparked my interest in the mentoring and coaching field. They were doing a lot of work around building professional capacity, team teaching. So I knew I kind of wanted to learn a bit more. So I moved back to Ireland and did a master's in educational mentoring at the University of Limerick. And again, when I was coming to the end of that, I was still teaching in a primary school, and I knew I wanted to really move and work in this space, and opportunities were somewhat limited in Ireland. So on a random afternoon in February, I just Googled education jobs at Monash. I don't know why it popped into my head. This job came up, and I said to my sister that evening, I said, you know what? I said, I think this is going to be my next step, or it's a space I want to get into. And before I knew it, it had all unfolded. I was resigning from my teaching job in Ireland, packing up my life, and I moved back to Melbourne on this day 3 years ago. And as you said, I'm now working it's mad how things all align. So I'm now working at the Faculty of University, our Faculty of Education at Monash, coaching pre-service teachers, student teachers, and their mentors kind of through their placements. And I'm also doing a little bit of study on the side as well in that field. So wow.
Brilliant story. And I know from our previous chats that we could do a whole episode just on relocation stories and immigration stories, but we'll spare everybody that. We have swapped
That'll be the next one.
Swapped notes on that before. But yeah, and so the way things align, as you say, that today's the day, the anniversary of you move. So that's amazing. So that's a really nice way to mark it. Thank you. And rather than you've been out partying and celebrating all that time, you're actually here talking to me about
doing what I love, talking about mentoring and
coaching. So it is a shared topic of interest tonight. My previous life back in Scotland in the University of Aberdeen, I was involved doing a similar role to you, as you know, working in that what I used to call delicate partnership between university and schools. because one can't exist without the other, and trying to support both sides of that equation, not as sides in any adversarial way, but managing those tensions that arise between developing capacity and building readiness in beginning teachers, as we would have called them in Scotland, and the assessment and kind of gatekeeper kind of function that you have absolutely in teacher education. So that's what we're going to talk a bit more about tonight, but really in terms of relevance for everybody, even if you're not involved in teacher education, this is similar to the tension that kind of exists when we often hear it in our training programs as leader, as coach. When you're in a leadership position or any kind of line management type of position in a school or anywhere else, and you're trying to initiate and manage developmental or growth orientated conversations with your direct reports and that kind of business language, hierarchical language, it's not quite as simple as saying, trust me, I'm your coach for this next 10 minutes, I'm not your boss. You know, how do you manage those tensions of appraisal with development and growth? So let's maybe start by thinking about, you know, that tension. It's very real in those early stages of development for new teachers or beginning teachers, all the different language around the world, early career teachers, pre-service teachers, student teachers, that group who are beginning. How do you see it?
I suppose when I think of that area of tension, you know, that you've just addressed there, it really comes down to the fact that a mentor or coach has to wear so many hats. So there's so many multiple roles involved in what they do. And that just adds to that level of complexity in what, you know, it's not just as simple as mentoring or coaching. There's so many extra layers to it. And often those different layers or hats have very competing intentions. You know, they're competing against each other. It's like growth and development or assessment or review. And then I think there is still a lot of people kind of view that mentoring coaching as kind of the status, the power, that hierarchy that you spoke about. So it's hard to try and create a coaching mentoring relationship that's devoid, you know, that doesn't have those tensions, you know, at the heart of it. And I think often those tensions are there and we don't address it. And like I was saying to you just before we came on Zoom, it's almost like the elephant in the room. Often we don't have this conversation about the fact that our mentor and coaches sit in a very grey, messy narrative. You know, whether it's like pre-service teachers, beginning teachers, or supporting staff at your school, there's always, as human beings, we judge all the time. So it's nearly magnified that little bit more when you put on the role of mentor or coach in whatever line of work it is, you know. So I think that's where it kind of sits in that kind of judgment, complexity, and also that kind of status that kind of comes with it as well.
Yeah. I think you've touched on a whole range of issues there already. Yes. that of course we have, but that messiness is an interesting thing, you know, and the what you said earlier there, the competing intentions of those different roles and the status. I'm curious about hearing a bit more of your thoughts on those, because, you know, status in your role, you're in there as a support for the school mentor and as a support for, I would say that, but on the other side of it, they might see you as a judger, as a measurer.
Absolutely. And I suppose in the role that I'm in, it's about having those conversations with schools or mentors and kind of saying, you know, being clear about what my role is in supporting and the purpose of, you know, what I want to achieve, what you want to achieve, in our collective kind of purpose. And when I talk about that messy narrative, I like to use that phrase quite a lot, because I think sometimes in education and lots of different ways in education, we try and make it a bit clear cut because we'd like it nice and neat. You know, maybe like a little bit of a checklist would be so handy. But for me, I think you can't eliminate those tensions. It's very much, how do you navigate it? So that's how I kind of approach it when, you know, people, you know, we'll have these discussions about that assessment and growth, or mentor versus supervisor. And really you can't live. I don't really think you can, because I think you'd lose a lot of that great learning. And like you said, mentors are often seen as the gatekeepers, you know, of the profession. And, you know, they'll use that language themselves. They'll talk about, you know, I'm bringing this person into the profession, or, you know, supporting this person in their transition into the
Definitely.
profession. So
Yeah.
I think it has to stay messy, which isn't the answer people often want to hear, you know. And
I think you're right. I think there's a human tendency, and I think there's actually, it's probably more pronounced in beginners or even in busy people. Just tell me the steps. And I used to get this when I was in your position as well, and I would get it when I worked in schools, when I was supporting some of those mentors in schools to help the graduate teachers get through their induction period. So the teacher registration body in Victoria, as you know, the VIT, have particular requirements. But sometimes that person didn't put their hand up to be a mentor, and what they want to know from you and from the VIT is, what hoops do I need to get them to jump through? And you're trying to hold the line of, but it's not about that. It's about helping build their capacity and growth. It's not about a procedural. But sometimes the graduate just wanted to see the hoops as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is another thing I was kind of reflecting on the build up to this, on the different things I've been reading over the last couple of years in mentoring and coaching. And no matter how great they may present a mentoring model or coaching advice or mentoring research, the bottom paragraph, the last paragraph will always say, but mentors and schools don't have time. You know, so people, because people want, and I myself, I am guilty of it. I'm a recovering primary school teacher. I love a good checklist, you know. So it's I suppose it's about, I think, a coach and a mentor. Our role really is, you know, in school leadership, you know, in this space, it's about creating conversations where we talk about the messy narrative. How are we going to navigate around it? And that it's really impossible, I personally anyway, I feel, to checklist it off or make it clear cut as often, you know, what people are looking for.
I think there's definitely there's a messy narrative. You're right in acknowledging that. I like that notion that you're kind of naming the elephant in the room up front, and you're saying, right, so how do we manage it, negotiate it, deal with it, but not eliminate it? You know, otherwise it does become, here are the hoops, jump, right, tick, tick, tick.
And that's what we're all trying to push back against in education and in teaching. You know, I talk to any of my teaching colleagues and friends, and they will say, you know, that assessment narrative that's so prevalent, and definitely back UK and Ireland and Scotland, you know, that's very prevalent in the education system there. And I think that's why it's so important to, you know, kind of protect the messy narrative, you know, because that's what you know is the great thing about mentoring and coaching.
So we're kind of highlighting there that there's a tension around status, around perceived status. Around you're here to measure me and judge me and tell me whether I'm past muster or not. And there's probably an acknowledgement that they know and they want your advice and support. And when I say they, I mean the beginning teachers. Is it okay if I use that term the whole way through, because it's the one that's stuck with me?
Yeah, let's go with that.
It kind of captures early career teachers and pre-service teachers. We should maybe clarify as well for everybody that when you're talking about mentors here, you're talking about people in school who have a responsibility for overseeing a school placement, for example. Is that fair?
Yeah, almost like an internship, that they may be there for 3 weeks to 4 or 5 weeks. It kind of depends.
Yep. So that's the label you give them. And you've used the label coach as well, and you've used the term coaching and mentoring conjoined. And you and I know from the literature that's a challenge in the literature, that they're often conflated and conjoined. Could you say a bit about those actual conversations then? So they're messy and there's multiple things and intentions. What would the ideal conversation kind of look like if you were the university coach, mentor, supervisor, whatever you're called, tutor? They're all loaded, aren't they?
I don't know which one I feel
so
most comfortable.
Whatever you are, you're the Monash University person going in, and you're going in to have a conversation about how it's going, and one of those hopefully developmental conversations with a student teacher. And similarly, when you're not there, the mentors are doing that.
Absolutely.
How do you see the kind of ideal kind of conversation there?
Well, I suppose when I think of those conversations, or, you know, stepping into the role of a mentor or a coach, you know, whichever one floats your fancy, I kind of see four kind of key areas stand out. And Firstly, that it's grounded in relationships. Like, for anything to happen in that space, there needs to be a relationship of trust and respect. And I think that's what's quite challenging sometimes in initial teacher education space, because the student teachers or beginning teachers may only be there for a couple of weeks, you know. So it's different if you have someone like a grad or one of your staff that you're supporting, because you already may have a relationship with them. So definitely that element of relationships, that it's learning focused, that we keep that, you know, front and center in our conversations. I think the importance of reflective practice, you know, that's informing what we do, that reflective practice is informing what we're doing. And then that acknowledgement of the context, where is it taking place? Because, you know, each school brings their own culture to how they approach supporting beginning teachers. And again, that's another elephant, I think, that's a lot of elephants around, that needs to be kind of just, you know, given a little nod. So for me, those kind of 4 areas, when I chat with mentors or with schools about, you know, how they can look at building that culture to support staff and beginning teachers, they're kind of 4 things I think that need to be considered or reflected on.
Definitely. And I think that, yeah, relationships first, you know. And
first and foremost. And, you know, you'll hear people talk about, you know, we were saying this earlier, but, you know, that element of vulnerability. There's a vulnerability in entering into any of these conversations. And like, I've recently just started getting coached myself, and it's been so empowering and interesting for my own practice as a coach to be at the other side of it and see that vulnerability that you have to bring to trust somebody to guide you in your learning or in your next steps.
Sure.
And I suppose another thing that just kind of crops to mind when we talk about those relationships is acknowledging that the beginning teachers are adult learners. So that adds another layer or a dynamic to it, to the coaching and mentoring relationship, because often we'll apply our teaching strategies. I know myself, I'm guilty of, you know, going back into my primary school teacher mode, you know, and then realize that this 20-year-old that I'm mentoring or, you know, supporting is not the same as my year 11, you know, my year 6 or year 11 or whatever student that you'd be teaching.
Yeah, been there too. 2 stars and a wish might work for the children, but it might not go down as well with the adults that you're working with, you know. And it's that they're fully formed. I think that's one of the key differences. And when you say it as an adult educator, as we both are, you kind of go, well, duh, you know, I should have known that. You know, of course they are. Of course they're not the same as, and no teachers you work with will say that either. You know, it's just we fall into this because we're through and through, we're teachers, and that's a big part of our identities. And then we forget to take account of that formed adult identity that they have that you're working with.
Yeah, and I came across something really interesting there that I read, and it was saying that often the pre-cert teachers, the beginning teachers that are coming to our classrooms have an idea of how they want to teach. They know they've already got those assumptions and beliefs, and it's often built on the way they were taught, which might not be the way that it's being done anymore. So they're coming in, their point of reference may already be outdated. So it's, you know, that really, for me, I was like, oh, I never really thought that. You know, coming into my classroom.
You've got sparks going off here. There's 2 links I want to make there. One is to Stephen Brookfield's work. You've heard me mention Stephen Brookfield before, Reflective Practice, and he talks about our autobiographical lens. I'm hoping to actually get Stephen at some stage to talk to us on here about this. But that autobiographical lens is how our teaching practice is often, he's researched this, is often influenced by our own experience as learners. And how we were taught, and how for good or bad, it doesn't mean we've had model educations and, you know, and so on. And then the other one you made me think of was, and I experienced this when I worked in teacher education myself, is you sometimes get people who have been very successful learners all their lives for whatever reason. And going back to being a learner and feeling like a complete novice again, and it not being as easy as they thought it was through their rosy lens of what it was like when they were at school. That can be a real challenge. It can be really confronting, and they need that space in those conversations to tease that out,
to navigate it. And, you know, you touched on something earlier about, you know, the beginning teacher wanting that advice and support from the mentor, and just kind of what you've said there has kind of reminded me, you know, that concept of the different levels of learning, that often in our teaching role, it may seem like we're doing quite a routine, simplistic task. There's actually a lot of theory and evidence behind what we're doing. And as an experienced teacher, you can kind of talk up to that theory, and then you can bring it down to the activity that's happening in the classroom. A pre-cert teacher, a beginning teacher, is just seeing that activity happening and being like, oh, is it just doing a focus group, you know? And I saw something where they were saying, you know, it's about making the tacit explicit, like all those that's going on in here. How do we make it explicit for our pre-service teachers and beginning teachers to understand the depth of knowledge that goes behind a task that may seem quite routine or simplistic in nature?
Absolutely. And I think the more experienced you get, the more you've got that kind of issue to deal with, that there's so many rules of thumb and experience-based, that wisdom, that practical wisdom that you acquire over the years, that you forget what it was like to have to consciously do those things. So much of it is unconscious, you know, and you're so when you're doing your explanation, or you're trying to help, this has been a bugbear of mine for years, Mary-Clare, so I'm going to vent for a second here.
Get it out.
When student teachers are sent to school, and I used to send them as well, but when they were sent and they were told you've got to do X number of hours in your area or your method if it was secondary school, and their subject, and then you've got to do X number of hours observing all around the school and seeing different classes. What we typically did was just find people to accommodate them and keep them safe and warm for a period at a time. And they just sat and watched another adult work. That's really all they did, is watch somebody be busy. And then sometimes they would say, well, I like them, I like the way they do it, I'll try and be them. And you know how fatally flawed that is, to try and be somebody else. You know? But what they missed was the very deliberate things you were doing. So what I want them to be doing is, when they're doing that observation, I'm going to suggest a checklist, is that they actually are able to notice the things. We're actually heightening their noticing. You're doing it in coaching, but we want them to be able to notice what you're doing, when you're doing it, and what difference it's making on the other side of it. I think that's a key skill in those support conversations. You're almost presenting lenses. Again, there's that other one to the student teacher. And
I think that comes back to, you know, keeping it learning focused. And that's where those, like, in an ideal world, I would love to be able to facilitate more of those conversations at schools, or for schools and mentors and pre-service teachers to really have the time to unpack, right, what are we going to try and achieve here? You know, and for the pre-service teacher or the beginning teacher to be able to identify, right, what are some short-term goals, but also some long-term goals, like, well, what's your commitment to the profession? Like, what are areas that you're interested in learning about? And then that helps to shape up those moments, because we know that happens, that, you know, beginning teachers, like you said, are kept somewhere to keep them warm, and definitely back in Scotland, they didn't need that. So, you know, it's how do we make the most, how do we maximize the learning potential of these teaching placements or these graduate positions?
Can I be challenging, coach?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Because I heard something there that somebody might challenge, I suppose. One of the things, you won't hear it from me or any of my colleagues, but one of the things that sometimes people perceive coaching to be a bit like is that it's kind of pick your own adventure. You know, it's a bit like life, warm and fuzzy life coaching. You know, what do you want to be better in your life? Oh yeah, I can help you on that journey. And, you know, you just pick some random thing. Teaching's not quite like that. It's complex. But there are standards that your guys and newly graduated teachers have to meet all around the world. There's different equivalents of those things. Standards they need to meet, hoops they want to jump through, if you like. And there are also things that they need to know how to do or to learn. You know, I'm not saying there's a Teaching for Dummies book out there, otherwise we'd all be out of business. But you know, the Holy Grail is not going to exist where this is it. But we are constantly learning more and more about effective practices and things that are more well-founded than others. I'm using very fuzzy terms there deliberately, rather than what works. How do you navigate that tension? You know, because there is a sharp edge to this. Because the way you put it there was, you know, what do you want to be as a teacher? How do you want to be? And that's quite high level abstract kind of concept for some of them. When they're there, and I've got one particular student teacher I worked with in my head, and he went on to be very successful, I should say, before I share this teeny story. He said after his first placement, oh, you're filling our heads with all this theory, when what we need out there is the weaponry to survive The weaponry is the term he used. And I went, oh, ouch. And what he meant was, I'm struggling with the basics here to get my class in order, figure out how I need to operate. I can see these experts doing it and the kids are eating out their hands. How do I do that? And you're taking me to too high a level. We weren't, but that was his perception.
Yeah.
How do you address that in those conversations?
I suppose what you would hope in initial teacher education is that we have, and I feel like it is happening, that there is greater connections with schools. And really it's that, you know, that the initial teacher educators partnership with schools, and how do we tap into that and build that relationship? Because that's the only way, you know, pre-service teachers and beginning teachers will tell you that they are so excited to get back on placement. And definitely here in Melbourne, we didn't really have placement last year. They are so excited at the moment to get into schools. But it's like, how do we make sure they've got what they need when they're out there? And like the standards, sometimes it does become a bit like not a numbers game, but you know, they're on a 3 or 4 week block. We've got X amount of standards. I suppose this question has been posed to me quite a bit when I'm at schools. And I always come back to the concept of growth. I'm like, anyone who's working with you as a coach or mentor, we have 3 to 4 weeks to grow their teaching abilities, their teaching muscle, their teaching craft. But, you know, and the standards filter down through that. But I find if you keep the focus on growth, because, you know, sometimes we have situations where mentors will be worried about pre-service teachers and say, look, I don't think they're meeting the standards. I don't think they're at the level required. And we say, right, well, let's just shift the conversation slightly. That's okay if that assessment element of standards and demonstrating it. What do they need to grow to build their craft right now? To, you know, and I think it's often about, with mentors and pre-service teachers, having you kind of have to meet them at their point of need. What's their point of need? And again, come back to the importance of those conversations early on. Either before or just when you have a new grad working with you, and really getting, if possible, taking time to reflect on, you know, what are the areas you feel comfortable with, and having those conversations so that you kind of start to get a starting point. And I think if you can ascertain where the beginning is, then you can, you know, I always say, what's the next step? You know, because you could look, small steps, because you could, you know, and it is overwhelming when you go into a classroom and you see some teacher who has these 25 children, you know, working beautifully, and it's all just, you know, all in synchronicity. And then you stand up and you think, oh gosh, you know, I've been there myself. I still
feel their pain. You do.
Teaching placement, you know, it's etched to my mind. But I think it's that conversation, that concept of the next step, and keeping it in a growth kind of a mindset.
I think you're right. And your role is to keep that perspective on what we're judging here. We're not looking for Teacher of the Year 2021 here. What the phrase I used to often use was, you know, are they ready for entry to the profession?
Yeah, I thought that was a great question.
Entry, you know, not finished article. This is a work in progress for all of us forever, if we accept the complexity of the work. You want to know that they're sustainably on that trajectory to getting there. With enough confidence within the constraints we work on. I'm conscious I put you in the spot there, Mary-Clare. I don't want to start a debate about assessment practices. Okay. The conversation about it. I don't want to put you in a spot in terms of kind of assessment practices at university, the merits or otherwise of having national standards. One thing I will say about the standards, though, before I bring us back to coaching and mentoring conversations, is, you know, I don't think they were ever designed to be assessment tools. You know, that's you know, and they're being sometimes used quite bluntly like that. And as a point of reference was more the way you described it, as a lens, again, that kind of concept.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, just in our profession in general, that we keep these documents that on one A4 page, they're meant to sum up what you do in an average day, you know. And when you chat to pre-service teachers, and it's interesting actually at the moment, some of the pre-service teachers who maybe have had 18 months of theory, so, you know, they've just done a block recently, and for them, seeing the 18 months of theory and now going in to see that in a 20-minute block, the amount of things that are happening, you know, and you're having conversations with them and they're like, I don't know how they do it. You know, they're just in awe, because until you see it, you know, you see it in action, an A4 page is never going to sum it up. So I think it's really important that we keep that, it's growth. We're looking to grow and develop, because that can take too much airtime if we give it.
It does.
Give it the
Yeah,
airtime.
and it becomes overwhelming. I think you hit on that as well, that change happens in small, that's back to coaching principles, isn't it? Change happens in small steps. It's an iterative process, and I'm here to guide you through that process and help shine a light on what's happening, what might happen next, and so on. I think that's nicely bringing us back to coaching and mentoring here. But that's why we're talking about this, because we're both involved in having those kinds of conversations against that backdrop. It's back to your context point again. There's always going to be some context within which you have these. And, you know, I don't know life coaching. I don't do life coaching, but I'm not sitting in a cafe hearing a story about how your life is and so on. We're actually in there and amongst quite a dynamic relational system with imperatives, you know, with the welfare and outcomes of children at stake. It's, you know.
Yeah, and I think I'm actually glad you brought up that question, because I think that this is the problem sometimes in the mentoring, coaching, in initial teacher education. We often just kind of dance around that there is this standards document, you know, there is assessment conversations. We are thinking about, you know, the betterment of the profession and the students that we're teaching. So I'm glad you actually brought it up. It's
and I come back to, you know, when we talk about coaching way of being, one of the aspects of that is faith in the capacity of the other person. In the counselling world, they talk about unconditional positive regard. You know, if you don't have that for the people you're supporting and working, whether you're a mentor or a coach, whatever you're called, and that's going to show up at some stage in that conversation. It's going to show up as judgment. And that's going to kill that psychological safety dead. So, you know, I can see how in our roles, you tend to, when you see those tensions and you see the conversations that are going really well and you spot the ones that aren't going quite so well for you. And I did a lot of this before I ever knew anything about coaching, Mary-Clare. You know, I spent 5 years at Aberdeen University before the word coaching was in the education landscape in the UK. So I now look back saying, right, okay, that was more coach-like by accident, and that was less coach-like, and that's maybe why it didn't go so well. You know, so it's that judgment dial ramping up inadvertently, or, you know, the wrong point of reference. You know,
I think as well, though, it's about like empowering like mentors with that language as well, because often mentors, and I know I have felt the pressure of having a pre-service teacher with me, you know, wasn't going great. I'm thinking, oh God, you know, and there's a pressure of, you know, what do you do? And I look back and I wish I had the language that I now have to help me better guide those conversations, so that there's a better outcome for the person I'm, you know, coaching or mentoring, but also just in general for the whole situation, that it's more, it's a positive learning experience, but there's learning at the heart of it. As in, it's not fluffy saying you're doing great and it's obviously not going great, or where you can't even engage in the conversation because you're so stressed out because that lesson has gone horribly wrong. It's going to take you a week to reteach that topic or whatever it might be. So I think there's a lot around that language that we provide to mentors, and tapping into, like you said, that coaching way of being. And a lot of those, a lot of the things that we've talked about today, mentors would be aware of them, and they probably do them without even subconsciously, without even really labeling it. But I think there's a need to maybe look at the language. Definitely for beginning teachers, what do we give out? So all the governing bodies, whether it's VIT, universities, what language are we sharing, or what message are we giving out to schools when we talk about beginning teachers or pre-service teachers? So that's something I'm kind of curious about at the moment, is the language that is going out to schools, and filtering obviously down to mentors. And
I think I hear us touching on lots of things that are embedded in effective coaching and mentoring. Actually, when mentors work really well, they're doing all these things as well. You know. Again, we could have a different conversation about coaching, mentoring, and everything in between. That's the other article that I wrote a little while ago. But there's that notion that you said there about guiding the conversation. How do you guide is an intentional thing, and you've done a bit of learning on coaching and a lot of reading coaching, and you've got practice that you learn how to guide those conversations with a particular intent, but you're also probably quite open about that intent as well with all the parties that are in it.
Like I reflect on conversations in the past that would have gone well, and it was purely by chance. because I didn't have the training or knowledge or information that I have now.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they all go as, 100% or anything like that, but I suppose it's just like being a teacher. I have more in my toolkit to help me navigate that messy narrative, and to support, and at the end of the day, ensure that the person I'm working with feels supported.
Guiding, navigating, helpful words popping up. Let me see if I can bring us to a little bit of a focus for us. And we've got people here who haven't asked any questions yet, folks. What I would maybe suggest is we do just the next little bit. I'm going to bring it back to, so we've really kind of unpacked a lot of the tensions there, the different factors, the contextual stuff. That wouldn't actually be that different if, it's similar. If you are trying to be a head of department, managing people, and a coach, being a year level coordinator and a coach, you've got responsibility for standards and quality and experience and consistency and curriculum development, you name it, the list is endless. But you're also trying to build the capacity of people and help them be the best they can be. What I'm going to suggest, folks, is if you've got questions that come along, I'll take those. We'll leave time at the end to do that. And just post them in the question and answer box there, if you like. If you don't ask any questions, Mary-Clare and I will just keep talking for the rest of the night anyway. But by all means do. It'd be good if there are things that are popping into your head that you want to open it out into. What maybe bring us back to, we recognize those tensions exist. But the thing we've not probably covered yet is, and you said you can't eliminate them, you can navigate them and so on. Or I've heard, one of my esteemed colleagues in the States talked about ameliorating them. So how do we ameliorate? It's a lovely word, ameliorate or mitigate these factors, these things that get in the way sometimes, that change the dimension or dynamic of the conversation. What do we actually consciously do? And this is me putting the coaching thing on here now, is what would we be consciously doing? What would the other people notice us doing to try and mitigate those things?
I suppose, like, if you're talking about what would you actually see, so for me, what I would be putting into place, if I'm trying to build that relationship, I would be possibly not necessarily, like some people use contracts, and I've seen mentors kind of create almost like a contract with the teacher they're supporting. For me, I personally prefer more of an informal contract where we're very clear about what are the expectations, the purpose, and almost nearly backward plan the journey to a certain extent, to say, right, well, we're here for, you're here working in this school for 3 to 4 weeks. What are the expectations, and just having that open conversation to almost map out the journey. And I feel those conversations can help create a little bit of a collaborative kind of partnership, because you're saying, right, we're going to work here together through it. In building that reflective practice, do you want? Have you got a question or?
No, I've got a couple. We'll save them just now. Yes, great. I've got a couple. Thank you. Thank you.
So I don't know if you wanted me to
start. No, it's okay. On you go.
So then I suppose that kind of sets that relationship element, that foundation stone. And then those other areas that I touched upon, like learning focus, like identifying those next steps. So after, someone has taught, or maybe they've, whatever area they're working on, that we're mapping out the next steps. Where do they see, like what's their ideal end goal? Where are we now? Where are we going to take it to? I think the reflective practice is a really important one, to try and embed as much as possible. I've seen some amazing mentors get the pre-cert teachers, their beginning teachers, to have their own kind of little debrief group where they come together and they unpack what they're learning. I've seen mentors do amazing things with Google Drive, where they're encouraging the pre-cert teacher to keep a regular reflective journal, or coming to them with one reflective question. So those kind of strategies. And look, I suppose what's hard is they are often in short blocks. So sometimes people worry, is it tokenistic, because they're like, oh, I don't know how much is embedding into it. And obviously that's a conversation for a whole other day. But I do think it sets the tone of the relationship.
I think so. And I think it's back to being realistic and having realistic expectations of teacher education. Again, we could do that whole topic of what's right and wrong with teacher education and the model, but that's not what we're here to talk about. And actually, as coaches, that's realistic. We've got to help people work within the context they find themselves. We've got to help them feel more hopeful. We've got to help them feel that they've got some degree of choice and control over their circumstances. If they don't, they feel hopeless. And that's when they drop out. That's when they burn out and so on. You've got to help people. And that's, again, part of my own interest in that ecological view of agency. Actors in context is what we're talking about here, and you've already flagged they're all different. I think there's a couple of things I would pick up on there. That contracting term is a term we use in the coaching industry.
Yes,
And it was one that didn't sit well with me when I went back to school to do coaching, because it sounded too contractual, formal. And I know that within a short period of time, we had what we call the coaching agreement. And it was just a written point of reference. Now, you probably have something like that in your documentation that goes out pre-placement. And it says, this is what you can expect. This is what you're going to expect. When we came out, this is what we do. This is what we don't do. Well, if you don't, maybe there's some suggestions. I don't know. But similarly for the mentors, I'm sure you've got guidance and things you give. So, those are a form of contract. Whereas if I've got a formal paying coaching client, there is actually a financial side to it, and cancellations and lending you resources and all. Actually just setting out, I wrote a blog post years ago when I was doing this in school, and I called it terms of engagement. And some folk thought that sounded a bit too military. But what it was about was contracting. It was about, are we both clear when we enter into these conversations, what my role is, what your role is, and what some of those tensions will be as we go.
And that's where the language, I think, is so important. The language that's in that document sets the tone. And that's where I say I'm really curious to look at.
It's a point of reference. When it goes awry, you've got something solid to come back to and say, look, can I just revisit this and so on. And I think that's fundamentally important, because that's one of those things that builds trust in you. And you mentioned that relationship and trust earlier, but it's actually trust in the process. I mean, I can like you and trust you as a person, but am I still wary of the system that you're within? And there's trust in the process, and there's trust in the person. I think that's
a really good point.
Theory anyway. We should say these are theories. Neither of us have cracked this completely, and we're sitting here as experts. But these are things we've got the privilege in our work of wrestling with and chewing on. And the other one I would pick up there, and I've got a couple of questions in a minute, is that notion of reflective practice. Because reflective practice, and this is one of the things that Brookfield says as well, and there is a question about that, I'll say in a minute, is that reflective practice is kind of one of these, what he calls motherhood and apple pie terms. The Americans would say, they just throw it around like engagement and without stopping to think, what does it actually mean? And people will say critically reflective. What does that mean? You're just hypercritical of stuff. Oh, no, it doesn't. And equally, reflection doesn't mean just sitting around keeping a journal and thinking about stuff. If it's going to be put to a purpose, what we found, certainly in the work that we've done around coaching in this and people's coaching development, is often what they need are some prompts or protocols. So some of the thinking routines that are well known, some of Ron Richards, cultures of thinking stuff, is actually really relevant, really closely related to what we do in coaching, I think, in that if you're going to think about something, you want to think about it through a lens. That always resonated with me, or against that point of reference. What's the neutral point of reference that we're both looking at to make some kind of.
And it's really about trying to make people aware of their assumptions, because so much of our behavior and our teaching and learning is subconscious. We don't even know why we're doing what we're doing. And it can be really hard to change that, in somebody in a short period of time. So I always say to mentors, well, let's just see if we can make them aware. Can we make them aware of what deep down is informing their philosophy of teaching or their assumptions about teaching and learning? Because to change it or challenge it, that's a whole other process. And sometimes, it can happen. But, if we were to sit and think about what are some of the things we just assume about teaching and learning, to change them, would be quite, it's quite a process. So I think it's also about being, because you said like reflective practice, that gets bandied around the whole time and everyone's like, oh, they're reflecting. And reflective practice doesn't necessarily mean that they're learning, So I think it's looking at it, kind of taking it down a little step and say, right, well, we mightn't be challenging and changing every element of their practice, but if at least we can make them aware that they are coming into their teaching role with these assumptions and beliefs, and how do they sit with them now that they're in a school working with a mentor?
Based in the reality, great, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions. I'm just trying to read them here and decide which ones to go. Thank you, Nick Shepherd, and Chris Brown. Hi, Chris. We know Chris. So Right, this might keep us going for the next 15 minutes, but this is great. Thank you. Nick, you've said you're curious about the autobiographical lens of a mentor. The way they were mentored. Oh, that's interesting. The way they were mentored back in the day is often their point of reference. They mentor how they were mentored. What's the potential impact of that, and how can that be updated if required? It's a bit related to what you said. Thank you so much for that question. That's a brilliant question. It's a bit like what you said about assumptions.
Yeah.
You know, you make assumptions, and when we spoke a few weeks ago about doing this, we ended up, people will not be surprised to end up, we took nearly 2 hours rambling around about this. And actually some of it we've repeated here and some of it's brand new, so that's lovely. But we talked about that notion of people's perceptions of what these titles mean. And they base that on their own experience. You know, their lived experience on either side of that. How do you see that then about, because you work without naming names, or I'm conscious you need to be sensitive that you don't give the impression that you've got really bad mentors out there, but it's not good or bad. It's actually just people do it in different ways because of their assumptions and their own experience.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, it's not necessarily about good or bad. It really comes down to what's the culture at the school. How do the school see and value it? And I think if the culture at the school is informed about what it means to support, you know, what are the skills and strategies, and if they're trying to develop that in their staff, that does filter down. And look, it can be really hard because some people will have a very definite view, the whole sink or swim, in you go, best of luck, talk to you at the end, you know, and there is that mentality.
Didn't do me any harm. Yeah,
look at me, I survived it, you know.
Yeah.
You know, so there is that mentality. Of course there will. So I think it really is about what's happening at a school level. And we know that ourselves, when you try and bring any new initiative into a school, you know, you see, you know, who comes on board, and it usually just trickles down along, you know, people start saying, oh, you know, that seems to be working really well, and people come on board. So I think it really comes back to what's happening at a school level, and the language. You know, what language is in those documents that is going to have a growth mindset on placement, or, you know, supporting graduates. Because if the documentation you're getting is assessment driven, well then sure, of course you're going to apply those sink or swim.
Going to say that's it. Jump through the hoops. Here they are.
Yeah.
Nick, I'd maybe add a little bit to that. Thank you, Mary-Clare. That I think part of it is role clarity, and again, that's an easy term to say, oh, we need role clarity. But actually, and this is not because I'm work for a training organization, but you do actually need some training. This is something that I think we're proving in this conversation doesn't come naturally to everybody, but part of it is the expectation that sits within the school culture. You're absolutely right, Mary-Clare. You know, that'll be influenced by that. But, you know, I'll use the example in Victoria, where with the Victorian Institute of Teaching, and in that first year, the graduate teachers have to do X, Y, and Z. It was very similar in Scotland in the induction process. And often the mentor happens to be the head of department if it's a secondary school. And they've not quite get their arm twisted up their back to be the mentor, but they didn't stick their hand up and step forward straight away and say, I'll do that. They're doing it because they've got some interest in the development of the profession. So often they're so busy. They're some of the busiest people. They're already got lots of responsibility. They're trying to do this alongside everything else. So that's their perception. A mentor is just a label rather than understanding the conversational and relational dynamic of what it means to be a really effective mentor. That this is you building a trusting relationship with this person. This is you, something we've not really touched on tonight, knowing how and when to deploy your expertise and wisdom that you carry. Yeah. They need your help. They're not empty vessels, but they're not the finished article yet either. But the way you do that is critical to the success of that relationship and how that person ends up walking away from that conversation. So there's more to mentoring than being an expert. I think that the phrase I use when I talk about instructional coaching or mentoring is knowledge and expertise is necessary, but it's not sufficient to be an effective mentor or instructional coach. So I think for me, where I would start in response to that, Nick, is we need to challenge some of those assumptions. We actually need to have mentor induction programs and training programs that help them. And it's actually not just about the logistics of the role. It's more about because that's the easy stuff. You can put that in a document. You don't need to
Oh
do
yeah, and that's what they
it's
get.
the relational
you know?
piece, it's understanding the dynamic, the adult learning principles, who is this person that's going to come in front of you. And then what happens when you step into their classroom, or you are standing beside them, or you are watching a video with them, So I think that's where I would start, but I completely agree there. Autobiographical lens. A lot of these roles that we have thrust upon us is what influences how we go about doing it. Great, thank you. There's a couple more here, well-known names. Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Chris, all right, Chris, you're throwing a challenging one in here, and I know you well, so this is great. So in coaching, we talk of accountability to yourself and your self-determined goals. I completely agree. I think part of that lovely tension that exists in a good coaching conversation is the virtue that I've actually said what I think I want to do and what I'm going to do out loud to another adult. Without Mary-Clare being my coach and be doing the oppressive, you said you'd do this, I actually feel compelled to do it. I completely agree that that's a lovely motivational part of it. Isn't this inherently inconsistent with the reality of pre-service or early career supervision? Good word. No matter how hard we try, as at the end of the day, the senior teacher has to make a judgment about progress. Hence, is it really at best mentoring? Well, I'd say at best judging or supervision or appraisal, I suppose. I think mentoring and coaching in terms of the support mechanism and the deployment, I'm not sure I would associate judgment with mentoring or assessing progress, but I see your point. How do you see that, Mary-Clare? That's that big tension again right at the end here.
Yeah, it is. And I'm just having a little read of it myself. And that is, that is the bottom line. That, and since we chatted last week, Chris, I was weighing it up and I was like, so could mentors do mentoring and not assess, and thinking of the logistics, how would that work, and I suppose I don't know, like that's being really honest. I don't know,
well, yeah. I'm not sure how to resolve it either, Chris. I think it's something we can mitigate through the contracting. We can mitigate by naming up front that this exists, that I have to be. And Chris, I know you're one of our coaching accreditation program graduates, and you worked with a coach who, I hope I've got that right, Chris, but you are now because I've just said it publicly, but you had a coach who helped you in your development and growth, and this is something I do regularly, but I also have to gauge at the end whether you've met the requirements and you're good enough for us to say you're an accredited coach. So there is that tension. It's not quite as high stakes as getting into the teaching profession or not, but there's going to be lots of situations where there's that tension. I think the adults that we work with, the adult learners that we've talked about, who are the beginning teachers, know that and can accept that. That there is a line where I have to say, it's not yet meeting the level that we need to see, and it's that readiness. There's that again. That language helped. That's how we ended up with that kind of language.
Yeah, I think the language, having those conversations. But like Chris is right, it's really hard. Like I'm thinking already of certain, students I've worked with who didn't, pass a placement, and, they have built such a sense of trust with their mentor and collaboration, and, almost like a, a professional friendship there, that they're really working towards it. And it can be really hard. It can really change the dynamic of the relationship at the end when, that this is how the conversation has to go. I have seen it though, like, and it's popping into my mind of a mentor who navigated it so well. And I think it was because from the very beginning, she constantly talked about growth, and I'm here to support you. So like you said, that you're ready to enter into that profession. And they continuously had those conversations whenever I would visit. So when the student, it wasn't successful, the student, I suppose there was such a sense of trust had been, and the mentor supported that student again on another round to help them through. And I just, it's just popping into my head now, there was, I suppose, so many conversations about that tension. The mentor was really open about the tension that she wanted to support the student. And I do think it's maybe addressing it, but what Chris has said, that is the fundamental
Short of having an assessor that comes in and does the dirty work afterwards, and having a coach or a mentor or someone who's a support who takes you on the journey.
I had that. That's how I did my teaching placement. The supervisor drove to the schools and you saw the car come into the car park. You had a mini heart attack in your classroom, and they came on our graduate year, in the same uni, and that didn't work either. I don't know what
That's it. Answers on a postcard, Chris. That dates me. Answers on postcard. Okay. Email me your suggestions. That'd be brilliant. Richard, thank you. It's not really a question, just an observation. Thank you so much for being here. Richard's in Northern Ireland, our podcast series host. Welcome, Richard. Do a plug for the podcast while we're here. That partnership between the university and the schools is something I mentioned earlier as a delicate partnership. One doesn't exist with the other. And yes, I think Mary-Clare and I would, forgive me for speaking for you, Mary-Clare, but certainly be on the same page with you there, that when the newly qualified teacher or the student teacher comes out, the school and the university should be on the same page in terms of this is a journey, it's a work in progress, and this is how we talk about your progress. Katrina, thank you. So Katrina's well known to anyone who's listened to and read our latest GCI Insights that went out. I'm getting to do lots of plugs here as well. Inadvertently, Katrina is a doctoral student at the University of Melbourne. Thank you, Katrina. So that distinction between trust and trust in the process, that's something that's just emerged as I've been talking to people about it in training programs and thinking about it myself. But there's much less written about the latter that you found. I think you're right. How do we foster one versus the other? Can the latter exist without the former? Do you know, that's a question to put to somebody like Chris as a school principal, to Chris Brown and others, that part of the way I would describe it is that the leadership in the school have a responsibility for creating the conditions where these processes are trusted. There shouldn't be any doubt in my mind as a teacher working with a coach or a mentor that they're not going to go run into the boss and say, wait, you see what I saw in Chris's class, or let me tell you about this. We may say certain things that to be confidential, or certain things will be reported back. For example, I would imagine the principal is allowed to know the kinds of things that people are doing with their time in a school. Why not? Or the kind of general goal areas that people are working on. So you're not just doing pick your own adventure, you're doing things that align with a place of education. I think there's certain structural things that are that can be reinforced, messaged, endorsed by the school leadership, that then have to be lived out by the coaches, face to face with the individual. So I think we can, but as usual, Katrina, we'll probably get more stories of when that's breached. It's easy to find the stories when trust doesn't exist and what happens. And what we see when that happens is the whole coaching model falls apart. And I had people who came and worked with me at one point from different schools. And one of the reactions I remember vividly was, oh no, you do coaching here. Oh. And I, of course, I said, tell me more about that. What's going on there? And it was from a place where coaching had been badged in a particular way, and it become appraisal. It become appraisal by the back door. So we end up damaging the integrity of the thing and then the process. And that just, once you lose trust, it's really, really hard to get it back, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Mary-Clare, in terms of your content.
No, I was just kind of going to reiterate what you said, when it comes to that element of training, we don't know what we don't know. So in order to build, that trust in the process and trust in that coaching or mentoring approach, it really comes, from that school level. How well are people informed? What language are they using when they're talking about coaching and mentoring at their school? And I think that can then help to build trust in the process, because if the dominant language is about growth and development, it sets a tone for what's going to happen through the process.
Definitely. Mary-Clare, we're out of time. Thank you to those of you who contributed questions. Thank you, Chris, your follow-up comment in there. Appreciate that. Nothing more for me to do than to say thank you, Mary-Clare, for a full-on hour of just brain busting stuff. When I do these things in the evening, I struggle to sleep because you just get these things fired up. You may well with the same.
I know I want to write down some of those questions.
That little emoji with the brain exploding is what we get out of this. It's a joy, and it's been a pleasure to share it with everybody. Before we go, I do have to do just a little bit of shameless promotion, but certainly you might have found out about this through a subscription. So we have a mailing list. The QR code is there. Everybody knows about QR codes these days, sadly, as we're tracking our movements around. But we do one of these a month, and we put out what we call a Coach Ed update. So it's a free resource once a month into your inbox, and 3 times a year we do GCI Insights, which is a more magazine format. And if you're on social media or you go on the website, you'll find the one that just went out a few days ago. So by all means, subscribe, and you'll find out about all the other things that we're doing. Thank you again, Mary-Clare. You're just down the road at Monash. I'm just 15 minutes up the road. Our paths will cross again, and we will talk more about all those other topics. All right. Thank you so much for your generosity and taking the time to speak with us.
No worries. I'm delighted. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. All right. Pleasure. Take care.